Well, my part of the Runaway came about when Mr. Rockwell came to our little school, and I was having lunch at the end of the bench, and he had the principal come and get me, and he gave me kind of an interview that basically was, once he knew my name, I think he knew who my parents were, certainly, and how to get in touch, because the next thing I know, my mother said, put on a good shirt, you're going to go pose for Mr. Rockwell. And my father picked me up at school, and we arrived at a Howard Johnson's restaurant on the Pittsfield Lenox Road in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. And there was a state police cruiser there, and inside was a very large state trooper who turned out to be your father.
My dad.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Richard. And the rest is history. We I don't think we were there more than 45 minutes, because the amazing thing, it seemed to me, I'd done two postcards with Mr. Rockwell, and the amazing thing always was that there was never a lot of, well, let's try this, let's try that. We sat on the stools, and he moved our hands, and he might have changed our arm position or something, and then the photographs were taken, and that was the end of it. And I remember the highlight of the day really was that Richard let me fire off the siren in the state police cruiser, and that was a big deal. He said, you push that thing, and I pushed it, and sure enough, that siren went on. It was great. It was really great. And then years later, I don't know if you know this, but years later, we kind of lost touch, obviously, because we were kind of different generations, really. But into my driveway pulls Richard Clemens in a regular car, because I think he was working for the district attorney at the time. He was a detective. And there had been an incident where a certain person from our town, of my vintage, had gone to jail and then escaped from jail and disappeared. And he wanted to know if I knew anything, if I might have any insight into where that kid was. And I did not, but that was really the next time I remember us having any contact. And then we both attended Berkshire Community College night class, and we had a class, and I want to say it was a logic class. And it was the great thing about that place and that doing that is that there were adults, there were kids who were just out of high school. There's all these mixing of people, and imagine having a state trooper in a class with a bunch of college kids. I mean, it was interesting. It was great. We had a pretty lively discussion. And then afterwards, the painting obviously became a symbol for the Massachusetts State Police. And we ended up getting a call from the Massachusetts Air Wing to sign 500 prints, because that was going to be the gift they were giving away as their key gift for that golf tournament.
That was a fundraiser for the Air Wing.
Yes, for the Air Wing. Right? Yeah. And up until that moment, it never occurred to me how important that picture was. I think Richard probably sensed that he was in law enforcement. He understood how important that image was. But up until that time, I really didn't give it much thought. And then when I attended that changed me, and then, we went on a whole bunch of adventures together after that.
My dad was the trooper in the Runaway, and he lived 2 houses down from Norman Rockwell, and Rockwell's dog would periodically drift into my dad's yard, and he would get fed, and my dad would bring him back to his house. So he knew that my dad was a trooper, and he knew he was handy. Just like you, it was very common for Rockwell to use neighbors as models. He was on a deadline, and he had a whole town full of people, and that was convenient. And also, you all are pretty photogenic. So.
Yeah. Oh well.
Yeah. So my dad would say, as you know, he launched a nationwide
search
for the best police officer, and that's how I got the job. But that's not the case at all.
Yeah.
This was next door. So I knew that you met again, and you came back in contact with each other in the logic class. Education was a big deal to my dad, and he was determined when he left high school and went into the Marines that when he came back, he was going to get his high school diploma, and he did a dinosaur report to get his high school diploma at Williams High School.
Wow. And
then he went to school, as you were, to study for his bachelor's degree, which at that time, sort of university without walls was not really a thing. No. But again, he was very determined to do that. So the Runaway, was part of our lives. It hung in our pictures of it in our house, and we knew it wasn't until I think closer to the end of Norman Rockwell's life that it became a bigger kind of thing in law enforcement and in the Rockwell Museum, and certainly in our experience, where people were understanding that this was something that became sort of iconic in the law enforcement community. My dad took a fair amount of ribbing for having his notebook hanging out of his pocket a little bit. His stool in the picture is a little lower than your stool.
I remember those stories.
Bigger than you were. And if you look closely, we talked before about the reflections. That's the cruiser out front. That you can see in the reflection. So that level of detail was something that impressed my dad a lot. My dad was always marveling at Freedom from Want and the picture with water and ice in a clear glass on a white tablecloth. How could Rockwell come up with that level of detail? But similar to what you experienced with trying to get the pants just right. There's another picture of my dad that has him wearing his bunny hat in the winter, and Rockwell asked for that hat to come back to the studio so he could get the texture just right on the hat. And when you look at it sideways, you can see where he worked on the texture of that hat to make it different than the rest of the background. So it's interesting that his level of detail, and we have to remember, this was for a weekly publication. So he did this level of detail and scrutiny and photography and studies and whatever, not just a couple of times a year. He wasn't the only artist for the Saturday Evening Post, but he was the featured artist most of the time. So
and all the other stuff he did too, the Boy Scouts and all of that other advertising and things. Quite amazing.
It is amazing. Can I tell you about when my dad left the state police and he went into private industry? He was sent to look at a security system in London. And I'll be back tomorrow. And I was like, how? And he flew out on the Concorde, and he came back commercial. But while he was there, and he looked at Heathrow's security system, whatever that thing was at Heathrow, he went to lunch, and he sat down at a pub, and he had his state police ring on, and a fella sat down next to him, and he noticed the ring. Turns out he was from Scotland Yard.
Oh, wow.
And they struck up a friendship, and 2 weeks before I got married, Scotland Yard came to visit, and we were entertaining Scotland Yard. So, I mean, it's just another example of how widespread it became as something that you kind of strive for as an ideal, not just in Massachusetts, but that law enforcement in general, from tiny towns to a whole, London of all places.
Well, regarding that, Richard and I were at the Rockwell Museum one time, and we had a young man who was a Massachusetts state trooper show up. And he had just gotten back he was in the National Guard, I guess, and he was just gotten back from Iraq, from Fallujah, as it turns out. And he was tasked with trying to establish a police force in Fallujah. And he said, we took that painting.
No kidding.
And we gave the painting to the people left when we were leaving. We said we gave them that painting, and we told them, this is what policing is about. It's not just about arresting bad guys and doing all that. You have to be the protector of things and people. And we just, that just, for me, that was just an amazing thing to hear. And I get the feeling Richard kind of understood that all along. But,
I think he did. I think he kind of tried to live up to it. It wasn't a lot of an effort in his private life. He was still like that. That was Norman Rockwell. I don't think, although he was his neighbor and he knew him, he couldn't have known that was my dad at that time. But it was. Yeah. He truly was. And
he's, he made a lot of friends all over the world. I mean, it was amazing. And, we signed prints. I've signed prints from police forces in Manchester, England, and Canada, all over the place. And it's really been a wonderful experience. I'm glad, I got to share it with him. We made a personal appearance at the Eastern States Exposition one time. And he said, well, I'll drive you. Right. And so...
Go the direct way or the...
Well, he knew... He only knew Route 20 because that's where he got places. He understood that. And Fran, my wife, and I get in the car, and it was like we were like this the whole way because he drove those roads at 70 or 80 during his time as a trooper. Yeah. And we, and I mean, it's a winding road. And we didn't think we were going to make it, but we did make it. We were in good hands, as it turns out. But that to me was, that's Richard the Trooper. That was how we did things.
And when we were going for a ride, we had turnout gear in the car. If he heard a siren or smelled smoke, we were off to the race. Okay. We would be sitting in the car. Dad's got the turnout gear.
Oh my God.
So he was in the 37th RTT. He was stationed in Framingham, Northampton, Concord, Russell, where the ground fog didn't lift until an hour after the sun came up, so you couldn't see out the window. Lee and Pittsfield. When he retired, he was in Pittsfield in the district attorney's office as a detective and staff sergeant. He had, an average day many times, but he had many not average days.
Right.
He was on President Kennedy's detail when he came to dedicate the Frost Museum in Amherst in October of 1963, just weeks before he was killed. He was dispatched to Mount Greylock to a plane crash where they took a snowcat part of the way up and snowshoed for 2 miles the rest of the way. He found off-duty, he found someone in a gas-filled cabin and revived them in Hinsdale. In 1958, right, when the Runaway was published in September of 1958, April of 1958, he was off duty and there was a fire in a house in Stockbridge. I think it was Stockbridge. And it was presumed that there was a family in the house. He was off duty. He had no gear, went in the house. It turned out there weren't people, but he couldn't go out the way he came in. He was severely burned. And that was the introduction that my mom had to what it was going to be like, because they were married 1 month before that.
Wow.
So that was her introduction to what it was going to be like. And I remember her telling the story of when she went to see him at one point in the hospital, some of the scar tissue just fell off in the perfect form of his ear on the pillow. And that was life. That was the way it was going to be. Yeah. There was some average days. Dad goes, Dad comes. But he lived in a barracks in Pittsfield, 3 days on, 3 days off. My parents lived in a house in Hinsdale. They had one car. Yeah. He had it. Uh-huh. And there was my mom in Hinsdale with 2 littles and no car. And when he was home, we went to the laundromat because there wasn't a washing machine either. That was recreation, He had some other difficult cases. There was a tornado that came through West Stockbridge. Not a delightful day. And there were days where he would come home and you knew something, it was not a good day. Yeah. He would smell like a fire, or we hadn't seen him except to change his shirt when he was working on a case, and he could shave and change his shirt. He might have been under a car and then on someone's front porch that day to make a notification. It's not. Now I realize not the life of the average high school student family.
Right.
That the brown envelope in the dresser drawer was not for good news. That was what you needed to go to if there wasn't good news. That when he walked in the door, he needed a minute.
Yep.
You couldn't just go give him a hug because he had to get rid of his firearm, you know. And that was normal life for us. That was fine. And he handled it, you know, the way it should be handled. But now I realize how different that was than sort of the average life. There was one case, I don't know anything about the details, but I know it involved organized crime. And we came home and there was a package on the doorstep and one of us picked it up and he was not having it because he was worried that it might have been something nefarious.
Right.
So, but he had a great sense of humor. He had kind of a dark sense of humor, but he shared that with you. And that was the way they kind of dealt with what their days were like. And that camaraderie was very, very important for them to be able to.
Yes. There were, you know, you could tell that the guys he worked with understood what he understood, and it was, you know, that got him through. I mean, that's quite amazing. Yeah. I'm sitting on my front porch, and this gentleman pulls up in a huge car, a Cadillac, beautiful Cadillac, pulls up and walks up and goes, "Are you Ed Locke?" And I said, "Yes." And he goes, "No, you're not." And I said, "Yes, I am." And he goes, "Are you the kid that posed for the Runaway?" And I said, "Yes, I am." And he goes, "No, you're not." And I said, "Well, yes, I am." He said, "Oh, no." He said, "I own a donut shop in Newburyport." And some guy had come in. He said he beat me out of 3 dozen donuts and about 4 cups of coffee because he told me, I have that picture behind my counter, and he said, "You know, I'm the kid in that picture." And I said, "Well, it wasn't me." I said, I've never been in your donut shop. I'm sorry. And I always reflect because Richard, that's the only time anybody ever claimed to be me, apparently. And Richard used to say he met 100 police officers who claimed to be him in that, you know, in that painting. Oh, that's me.
I wouldn't say that it didn't faze him,
yeah,
but it wasn't his work either.
Yeah, I know.
So, you know, he would say, "I showed up, I sat on the stool." And that was the other thing, too.
Yeah.
He didn't just say to Mr. Rockwell, "Sure, I'll pose for you." He went up the chain of command to make sure it was okay for him to pose.
Absolutely.
And they called him a commandant at that time.
Yeah.
The commandant said that it was okay.
Okay. Well, I remember the whole incident about the. I just learned of that about the book, you know, and how much trouble he got into for having a brown book sticking out of his pants, and you know, and he said, "I had the black book," and then it was told to me that now, as a result of that image, that now the Massachusetts State Police are issued that brown book. So that's great.
That is great.
That's great. He told me a couple stories, which I can't repeat here, but, you know, a couple things that happened to him that, you know, we forget that the Massachusetts State Police were founded as the rural police force in the Commonwealth. And you know, they were out on patrol in crazy places and meeting really eccentric, crazy people out in the countryside, you know, and things that happened to him and people he ran into. It was just quite amazing.
Didn't they have to be quartered in people's houses that had?
Yes, at one point they did. Yeah. And I know I don't think he was all that much of a fan of being in the barracks, but he did it. You know, that's how they do it.
My dad was born in New York.
Yeah, I know.
So, yeah. Stockbridge was as rural as he was going to be.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Richard and I were doing a thing at the Rockwell Museum. We would periodically go there for what they would call Models Day, and a bunch of models, you know, of different things would show up, and Richard and I would always end up at the same table taking questions from people. And this woman said, "Are you available to go to Florida, to fly to Florida?" And I said, well, yeah, I guess. And she said, yes, I would like to have you and Richard fly to Florida to do a thing. And I said to her, when? And she said, well, it's in February. And I said, do they play golf in Florida in February? And she kind of chuckled and said, yes, they do. So they make the arrangements, and we are to fly to this event, which was essentially a birthday party, but it was a fundraiser for a group. The closest thing you can think of is like a PBA. It's an association of police forces and police officers who do things that are quite amazing. They would do, if one of their officers was going to night school, as Richard did, to sort of move along in their career, and they had kids, they would send a police officer to look after the kids. Wow. I mean, that's what this organization did. They would do Christmas presents for example, for officers that had been killed in the line of duty. They would bring Christmas presents to their families. They would do all these wonderful things. And I remember Fran and I, my wife and I, marveled at the fact that in order for us to go to Florida for 4 days, we had 2 suitcases, 2 sets of golf clubs. We had this stuff. Richard shows up, honest to God, with a duffel bag, with a freaking duffel bag. And we're going, Dick, did you check your bags in? And no, this is what I got. And I don't remember seeing him in the same thing twice. And I don't know how he did it. But
well, he didn't do it. That was my mom. Okay.
Well, it would have scared me to open that duffel bag to find out how well it was packed. But that's how he got around, right? I mean, he did that. And we go to, as it turns out, this dinner we had, I want to say 1,000 people there. And they were all in support. That was the Coral Gables Police Department, the Miami Police Department. We just met some incredible, incredible people. We get to sit to lunch. And now, your father was as conservative a Republican person as there was in this planet, right?
Yes.
Yes. Our dinner companion is Janet Reno, the former Attorney General of the United States. And of course, my wife and I are thrilled. And you can just tell Richard's going, oh my God, have I got to sit with this woman?
He kept it together.
He did. He was gracious, and everybody had a wonderful time. And she's a wonderful person. But you could just tell, boy, if he had to pick somebody to sit with to lunch, that would not have been his first choice. But he did. He really handled it. And just the whole experience of, we went to, on the way home, we had to leave out of Miami Airport. And we had a rental car. And we were escorted by police officers from Miami, from Coral Gables, from the Dade County Sheriff's Department. We were taken care of. I mean, it was just marvelous. Well, we get to the airport, and, the lines are going like this, all the way through the whole thing. So we come walking, my wife and Richard and I come walking down, and the local airport police are escorting us through the mob. And one of them goes over to an empty line. There's nobody in the line. There's no person no attendant, right? He waits, and this woman immediately comes there. The 3 of us go right there, right? And you can see the people. There's 1,000 people in the Miami City airport going, who the heck are those people, right? Are they that notorious that they're trying to get them out of town or something? But, I mean, it was just amazing. And off we go. And, they escorted us onto and it was just terrific. And we all, the 3 of us, enjoyed it a lot, being treated that way. But it was great. It was just a wonderful trip. It was a wonderful time,
There were other occasions where he would go by air to do another errand with handcuffs and a raincoat.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Bring
Yeah,
somebody
I'm
back.
sure. I'm sure.
So that was not as delightful.
Yeah.
Experience.
But no, that was great. And we went to the Eastern States Exposition, and we had a wonderful time there. It was a wonderful experience to share with him. It really was.
And the 50th anniversary
celebration. Oh, that was marvelous. Being taken from the picked up and brought to the world headquarters of the Massachusetts State Police in Framingham, and having all those plaques and all the stuff, and it was great. It was marvelous. And again, it never occurred to me how important that image was until those kinds of things happen. And being in Miami, that image is important to them too. That's the beauty of it. It's for a law officer in the United States. That's a great image.
He received correspondence from people who said how they were inspired to become police officers because of that, or that they had met him and, it encouraged them to go forward. And he was very humble about that, but he took it seriously.
Yes.
Yes. But it did have an impact on him as well. He knew there was a certain level of sort of responsibility that he rose to, but he wanted to encourage other people to do that too.
Yep. And like I often have said since, if there was a nationwide search, I think he would have been the guy.
Well, that's
my opinion. So
I think my dad would be really happy about that.
I hope so.
Because it is an important image, but it's also an ideal. It's not just an image, it's an ideal. And so I know that when he first died, you were not sure you were going to be able to continue to do those sort of appearances. And I think I'm grateful that you do, and I think he would be very grateful that you continue to tell those stories and keep that experience sort of alive. And he was an ambassador for the state police, but in Massachusetts, but also they were very good to him in New York as well. I would say, going to dinner tonight, Dad, where are you going? Homicide convention. I'm going to homicide. I'm like, who is happy? The homicide convention.
That's right.
But he would sit and sign. They were good to him. Everyone was just really, really kind and wanted to use the image for what its intended purpose is, to be an inspiration, to be a happy memory, to inspire us to be better than we are. And so I think he would be really glad that you continue to do that.
Well, I think Steve Bodway.
Yes.
Who was a sheriff in Maryland. Right. In Horford County, Maryland. Deputy sheriff. I don't want to get him in trouble, and I don't want to get... But he taught a class at Johns Hopkins University in police ethics, and he used that picture as his, as a significant part of what he was trying to explain, and that essentially it was what that officer in Fallujah said, that you have to be available to be helpful as well as being an enforcement issue. You have to be able to be that way. You have to go out and serve as well. And that to me seemed to be certainly an important part of what that thing stands for. Yeah. Well, it's all wrapped up in the kind of things that have happened to me as a result of being in that picture. But if you observe from my perspective, and believe me, I grew up as a hippie. I grew up in the 60s. And I can tell. I remember saying we delivered an address to one of the graduating classes at the academy, and I said, "Look, I'm a product of the 60s." I said, "Being in a room with this many cops is making me a little nervous." Right? So, and you just realize the kinds of people like today, this signing with the officers with their families. It's just, you have to appreciate how, and like you said, how difficult that is, how amazing that the work they do, and how people like us are beneficiaries of that.
That's right.
You know, I mean, you have to kind of, and having this whole experience has made me understand, you know, in a real way, how important that is.
Well, it's hard for me to look at it and not go, well, that's my dad.
Yeah.
You know, that's my dad. It did give him incredible experiences, but without them, I think he would have been the same guy.
Mm-hmm.
But with them, he was able to kind of, and he would probably never say this, but enrich and encourage and expand that sort of reach that he would have had anyway. People would offer him money to sign or visit or whatever, and he refused it every time. He said, "Listen, I sat on a stool."
Mm-hmm.
Norman Rockwell, it was his work.
Mm-hmm.
And, I did what I was told. That's a little simplistic, but still, that was my dad. That's really all I can say.
Yeah.
That's who he was.
That's good.